Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on philosophy, empiricism, modern European philosophy, and John Locke. If we had covered Hobbes, he would be the first Brit, but in fact he is the first Brit and English philosopher that we are going to cover here in modern European philosophy. We have covered Descartes, who was French, Spinoza, who is in Amsterdam and Portuguese Jewish, and we also had Leibniz, who is German. So you can actually see philosophy all over the place. As Hume is going to say, philosophy has flowered all over Europe in the last 80 years, that's 80, and very Gettysburg, but a bit apart from that, across the pond. So John Locke, from 1632 to 1704 he lived, which notice he is living between 1600 and 1700, that is right when Europe passed up the Islamic world and having more money and power, which some people like, some people don't like so much, and that's very much history. He is an English philosopher right in the period of all of these major philosophers and Isaac Newton. How is that happening right then in pre-modernity? He's an English philosopher and doctor who was friends with scientists such as Boyle and Newton. He is famous for two works, the classic text of Empiricism, an essay concerning human understanding, and the political text of two treatises of government. Locke was very influential on the American founding fathers, such as Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson, and through them the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Thomas Jefferson considered Locke to be one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived, and one passage of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is almost entirely lifted from Locke's political work. This is of course, back to Spinoza's work was somewhat plagiarized by Leibniz, but it really wasn't in an age where you just sort of take paragraphs from things, and there are few enough texts. You would think people would be super upset, and Spinoza wasn't entirely pleased. But paragraphs of the few texts that exist put into other paragraphs is kind of like putting the paragraphs about apples into your text about apples, in a sense. People seem to think, but they hadn't really wrestled all that out, nor have they, clearly. Excuse me. So we cover Locke's political thought, I do anyway, by myself right now during the pandemic, or may more extensively in social and political philosophy. I usually relegate Kant's ethics to ethics, and Locke's political philosophy to political philosophy. So this is a class in 20B, like 20A, more on epistemology. It is a rich history of European modern, pre-modern, and modern philosophy. That's 20B, one of the requirements for a philosophy major. But at the same time, we stick mostly to objective, subjective truth. Now, that's how I do it, and sometimes people work in Hobbes, say it's political. That's great. I do tend to focus a lot on objective, subjective truth. That is ethical and political, and then you can take ethics and social and political philosophy. That's the way I do it. It's not perfect. I do like that. I find it simple and easy, as much as I talk a lot and interweave everything kind of crazy, of course. But we're going to focus on Locke's ideas of objective and subjective truth. He believes there is separate objective from subjective truth, but he has odd thoughts on that, and I think one of the most important things you can learn in early, pre-modern European philosophy is not just Cartesian dualism versus Spinozian, I suppose, monism, and other things like that, although those are very important pieces and interesting. One of the interesting things here that I paused on as an undergraduate when I took 20B back in the day, up the hill from here, is that Locke says he can separate objective and subjective truth, but he actually doesn't really. He says red is subjective, a square is objective, and that is tempting. But actually, if you see this as not really being entirely true, it's very interesting to stop and ask yourselves, and I'll just do this right up front because I do find this the most interesting idea of Locke, and it actually is what Locke fails to do than what he does, but much, respect and love to him for actually being somebody who put forward ideas that actually ended up being wrong, but that's how everything works. He put forward a bunch of ideas about what can separate objective from subjective truth. It's my understanding that nobody actually sticks to Locke, but in spite of the fact today that people have not separated red out as subjective and squareness out as objective, and in spite of the fact that there isn't a simple table of objective and subjective things, I would say, and Locke tries to make one, people do still talk in analytic philosophy, and then rationalist and Kantian and neo-Kantian philosophy, as if there are simple differences between objective and subjective truth, in spite of the fact that, as Wittgenstein would say and argue, as I will at the end of the course a lot, red is not entirely a subjective nor objective thing. What Wittgenstein will say, and I'm just going to cheat and tell you this ahead of time, and I'm not going to explain this answer because that would sort of ruin all of what comes forward, of course. But in order to give you context of what we're doing in the class, Wittgenstein is going to say in many ways red is objective and in many ways red is subjective in your life. And that's just the color red. Let's not even talk right now about squares. We're going to in a second or two with Locke. And not a smoke monster. Again, that is John Locke is very much Locke, like from Lost with the smoke monster or something, and then all that remains unexplained and a bit subjective, interpersonally. So Locke says I can separate out red from squareness, the objective from the subjective. There's a bug floating around my face. And he says he can do that, but does he? And I say he doesn't, but it's interesting. People talk like he did, but nobody sticks to Locke and says, no, Locke really knocked that out. So what does that mean to you and I? We're going to explain this very idea as we work through the material. Because this is, again, very interesting, and in fact, you could go through the material quickly and say, oh, that's just not enough. And that's what Kant would say. This is not enough to separate the objective from the subjective, and then we go on to Kant and neo-Kantian thought from there, and formal logic, and Frege, and others, and early Wittgenstein, but not entirely with him. But at the same time, do we ever fully separate out the objective from the subjective, or is red both objective and subjective in various ways? So that is what I am asking you here. Locke believes that red is subjective and it is categorically subjective as opposed to something that is objective. Wittgenstein would say red is more or less a subjective or objective practice and experience depending on how you are practicing and sharing it with others, is what he technically says, and I have to stand with him and his later thought and say I do believe that is more correct, and Locke is unfortunately going to fail here. But again, much love for actually trying to set out the objective from the subjective and separate science and trying to get things correct for people, because that is, well, as we'll talk about right here, it gets a little political and unfortunately a little good and evil, as we'll talk about. Which makes Locke a man of his times entirely plenty, because he is, as people tend to be, somewhat dead. So we cover Locke's political thought more extensively in social and political philosophy, but a short summary is here appropriate. Locke believed that the power of the king or government must not infringe on the citizens' rights to life, liberty, and property, which you may notice life, liberty, and something else, without due process. That should also sound very familiar to Americans. We need due process, and this must be achieved. This is written in English, by the way, increasingly. A system of checks and balances, all of which should sound familiar to any American child. This might have originally been written by Locke in the Latin, but actually is increasingly language in the Brit and the Anglophonic and the English, out here's. So yeah, and in Australia a bit, although they say it funny. Again, some kind of moon man language to the French. What you have is that there's checks and balances, separation of powers, due process. That's a bunch of language which in English is going to be very familiar to Americans given government. Locke argues that the people have the right to rebel against the sovereign if the sovereign, the king or queen, infringes on these rights, or aristocracy, who's ever the nobility and the superiors. Similar to Confucius, who tells his students to overthrow an unjust and tyrannical local ruler. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all are entitled to the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hey, buddy. I have a cat rubbing my feet, and I cannot pursue happiness with him because I need to further pursue this lecture, and he does not. He could actually pursue the fly that's been fluttering around my face, and we're going to have to do something about that a little bit later. What do you think, buddy? Are you a cat of the people? I think so. Unfortunately, Locke is a little bit too much of the people, as we're going to get to here. And I don't mean, not to make so much of a declaration. I now declare this cat to be free. I will not infringe on his right of ways. So, Jefferson says we have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and or cats, if those make you happy or not. Again, sometimes. Perhaps, possibly, because happiness is eager to distribute amongst the people than property. At least that still seems it, again on the smartphones. According to Jefferson, because King George had violated these rights without cause, which is the Tea Party onward, but not this one. The American Revolution was justified. So this is all important political thought for Americans, which is why we're passing it over here with a quick flight. As many critics have pointed out, though, and again, it is a bit Berkeleyan, we're going to get to Berkeley, and he is actually a bit colonialist and wants to set up plantations himself, which is not so Berkeley anymore, is it? Not in spirit, nor thought, nor deed, nor word, nor feeling. As many critics have pointed out, neither Locke nor the American founding fathers, and again, we're just going to be, these are people of their time, So yeah, a bunch of slavery. That they did not believe or extend these rights to all of humanity, and there remained a great contradiction between the love of individual rights, and notice the irony, it's kind of ironic, don't you think? Again, free ride on your wedding day, where the sovereign can infringe upon the rights of the white men holding property, but guess what? Of course, what does this mean for women and slaves? Well, no, none of that extends downward, and then later does. Actually, the stages of this are, at first, very much like the afterlife was for the pharaoh, and then other people started building little pyramids we've found because they're trying to get up into the afterlife with the pharaoh. And I've also mentioned, oddly enough, like the Yi Jing divination system in China was not for you, it was for the emperor. What the heck does a fisher person need with a future? Are you kidding? A fortune? Why? Then fortune-telling trickles down from fancy card readings for royalty, and now every schmuck wants it. Well, you don't need anything. What do you need with the goddess? Well, no, I mean, like they... It's everybody's thing now. So it's a popularization of forms. And in fact, what you see here is that, yeah, it is very much democracy is what's for the top folks, and then it increasingly, slowly, or not so much, then comes downward, and it becomes rather populist in various ways. That is very true, and I will pause on that because we're not making this a whole political talk here. But that is very much the shape of it, and we all like it and lump it in many different ways, of course. Locke was, thus, in fact, ironically enough, again and sadly, I do like the terrible joke from the Reddits. It is, my friend told me, I don't know what irony means, which was ironic, because at the time we were waiting for the bus. Which doesn't tell you what irony is either, Locke was a major investor in the Royal African Company, a secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations, and a member of the Board of Trade. Now, you can guess, all of which were central to the African slave trade that took Africans, again, in the triangle of the rum and the sugarcane and all of it, and the gold, from West Africa to the Americas to benefit English plantations, and French and otherwise and all of that. They were, of course, competing with the French. While Locke argued that labor given to the individual gives the individual a natural right to property, he also argued oddly, and this is very Egyptian and in fact art all the way through with royalty, that the work of the artist is the work of the commissioner. Like that it's not, anybody can paint. Michelangelo started signing his name to things, rather late in the game because any idiot can paint and carve. It was for a long time. You just hire people to paint and carve for you decently. There were people who made their names. But it's like, no, it's just you're an artist. You just get hired a bunch and then it's somebody, a rich patron's name on it or not. And it's glorifying the people who are paying for it and their stories. Very obviously so. So when Locke says, oh no, you have a right to your own labor, he means no, whenever slaves labor for you, they don't get any of what they make, or women or other things. It's like, and then you reap the labor of everybody you own, your wife, etc. Again, as Homer Simpson says, this is my wife, I own her. Again, it's like you get all the muffins, that's all yours, So in a certain sense, this does not specifically extend to women or slaves or other people. Or white men who don't own property even then, plenty. That's the mid-late 1800s. So he's not thinking all white men, labor and then get their property. He means, no, if I pay you, then I get the building. You build and that's mine now, which is the way the money works, plenty, And I'm not stepping right in front of that, right there myself. But that is definitely that's not this for everybody. That's this key for some people. And that was radical, at the time. And is still weirdly, step by step today. Again, as I read jokes terribly on the Reddit, I told the layer cake, let's split, and it burst into tears, And again, much love to all those out there in your situations and tears and subjects. So, just as, again, the Homer says, but Dad, if you're the police, who's going to police the police? And Homer's like, I don't know, Coast Guard? It's on the coast, it's the edges, so much edge. As Jefferson, again, is saying all men are created equal and wrote that while owning slaves himself. So again, you're going to be like, I guess men isn't slaves. Cool, I guess, for you. Locke was clearly in agreement with the racism of his times, and that was just life and air and stuff, and was writing for the equality of Europeans who owned property, which I do increasingly remind people all the time, which is not to step on anyone's parade, but just fill in the whole picture, of course, because it could be seen as that. No, white guys owned property and got to vote most of them. The right kind of Christian white guy. Very recently, people have not been cool sharing stuff. People sort of in early, like non-literate civil tribes kind of share stuff back and forth, anthropologists tell us. And then things get very patriarchal and in tears, yes, like the layer cake. The Mayans, everybody. So we can say whatever we want about any of these people, and we do. And that is very much what all of this is. So oddly enough, again, Locke is the guy who says, well, you have the right to life and liberty versus the sovereign can't take that away without due process. But you can, of course, you don't have to give slaves due process and hear them out at all. Like, that's not part of the men who do the stuff. That is regardless of how left-wing or right-wing you want to think of me or this material, and of course I am organizing it as I do. That is certainly what I want to present all of the students regardless of your points of view. It is certainly very much that. Like, it is certainly very much that it would be, no, this is very much the picture, even if you and I have very opposed feelings about the duck rabbit, which is very much what this is as far as American history. It's good to have that wider frame altogether. And be informed, all of us. So as an essay concerning human understanding, so that's the political thought real quick. And again, that's actually technically for another class. That's how much we're covering that for this. So in an essay concerning human understanding is Locke's famous work on epistemology, which is a fancy word for what is objective, what is subjective, and how do we learn that. Now, ontology is a fancy word for what exists. Epistemology is how do we learn about that. Now, this class, thus, is very much an epistemology and ontology class. That means this is a lot about subjective and objective truth and meaning. That's basically what you're saying. Obviously, that you can keep going and use a lot fancier words as well. But in a nutshell, in the tiny walnut brain of the Brontosaurus, if they still exist, I think none of them ever did now. It's different words and species. We're being specific. That epistemology and ontology, what is, what isn't, how does things work, how does the mind learn it or not, and ontology is what is, and epistemology is how do we get that into our noggins or not. Now, if you're more inclined towards dogmatic objectivity, that there's a collective objective truth that simply is of a certain form and it's not how the mind views it in the tree falling in the forest, you would say that ontology is definitely a different thing from epistemology. There is what metaphysically or structurally must exist, possibly mathematically or rationally or logically, and then there is how we feel or have opinions about it or live as life. There's the central separate structure. This is very much like objective squares versus subjective red, in us versus the dog. In a certain sense, Locke is saying squareness is objective, redness depends on whether you're a dog or a human or not, is what he is saying. So squareness always is squareness, red may or may not be because subjectivity. And those are separate things. So a red square is subjective and objective right in front of your face. Look at a red square. It's a good example right here. You can Google it. And they pop up, And I also have a picture of Moscow, also, actually. And that's because when you Google image red square, you get pictures of Moscow. So I decided to put those next to each other and be like, aha, human meaning. Very Wittgenstein, very joke. Do philosophy and jokes. Terrible ones, preferably. They stand out, unfortunately. But a red square is both subjective in being red and objective in being a quantized four-sided square, is what Locke is going to argue. So for him, ontology is one thing, epistemology is somewhat, well, we get the square, the red or not, and then also learn about the square as four sides altogether, constructing these things. But of course, if you're more skeptical, you would say, well, epistemology, how we learn about the world and our culture, is very much ontology. Our lenses, our cultures, our institutions, our cultural practices, our forms of life, a la Wittgenstein, is how we live and what is true and meaningful for us. And before you say, oh, then somebody could just kick children and that's true, it would be Wittgenstein to say, is that what you observe and where are the forms of life in which where's the culture of serial killers? Is basically the easy question. And of course, a bunch of people in China think America's the culture of serial killers because they had newspapers, they now have websites, plenty, I'm sure. Probably more than Americans, just by quantity, but by necessity almost. But yes, it's like given all the websites and all the stuff, of course, we can definitely say who is the serial killer culture more so. But yes, given human beings, of course, both sides believe, well, we're stuck amongst a bunch of objectivity and subjectivity both. What you find is the more dogmatic say it's black and white, whereas the more subjective say it's shades of gray. We haven't yet gotten to Hegel, but I am sticking that in here because we are running up to the red square a la Moscow and not. And we are its geometry, and history together. That it's basically both objective and subjective, and Locke's going to try to talk about the two and separate them. I'm going to say decently unsuccessfully, and then Kant and Wittgenstein and others are doing that. Which always has good examples, and you should talk about, and people really should know the simple forms of, because these ideas are very much part of your life, whether you want it or not. The simple Wittgensteinian answer why is you are experiencing objectivity and subjectivity in your world, whether or not you want to side with me, Locke, Wittgenstein, or anything. So these ideas are angles in your life is the easiest way to say it. So that's why philosophy is such a wonderful thing. That's also why we're keeping political thought out of it a bit, you'll notice. Because if we get mixed up in politics, we're not focusing on what are the simple I like. Simple, maybe, perhaps not. Examples of a square, because by the time we get to the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, we are way out of red versus square territory. We're already not talking simples. We're talking complexes and a bunch of people seeing red. Yes? And some of them are very square. So on a winter afternoon in 1670, Locke met with friends to have a discussion about morality, ethics, and religion, but the group could not come to much agreement on any subject. I have to say, I think the same about analytic philosophy. They all agree truth is objective, and then they don't agree to anything else, which is a marvelous way of saying, I guess science is right plenty, which, of course, all of us have trouble understanding, waiting to put gas in our car. Pragmatics. So why the heck? Locke's like, well, we all agree to, white male objective truth. Yes, golf clap. What is that? Total disagreement amongst the billionaires. So it's like of their time, who weren't billionaires yet. Maybe there's trillionaires apparently, somewhat soon. I don't think that's Bezos yet. So, and it's not the Walmarts altogether. So, I don't know. But it made Locke wonder about how do we understand things, which is rather empirical. Now, Locke's an empiricist. He's going to try to gather this together. He is somewhat rationalist-like. He is actually he's the first empiricist, and he's very much the most rationalist and most deductive, certain of objective truth. We're going to walk all the way out to Hume, who says truth is practice, essentially, but prejudice also from practice. But for Locke, he definitely thinks there is objective truth. And so he is still very much the rationalist, but he's an empiricist. So he's going to try to gather stuff together inductively more and try to make a broader case for empiricism and inductive truth rather than deductive rationalists. I've come to principles and now I can purely deduce the square. He's going to try to gather the square from all sides and put it together. And that's more empirical, objective, inductive, objective truth. So he still is trying for objective truth, not subjective above that, but he wants it to be inductive rather than deductive, which makes him an empiricist rather than a rationalist, rather than like the other first few thinkers we were thinking. So Locke sat down to write what he thought would be a single page on the subject. This famously will come up several times in the class, actually. Several European philosophers say, so I sat down to write something about this. Took me 20 years. And now here's a book. I kind of think it's a bit of an answer, a little bit. I'm not satisfied with it. And everybody else is like, this is pure genius. That happens a lot in philosophy. And you can mock philosophy, but of course that's actually human thought, because like, here's a kind of tentative answer sort of to this. This is the next step forward. Ta-da! So he sat down to write what he thought would be a single page, and instead spent much time over the next 20 years writing his central philosophical work, publishing it in 1690. Now that again is almost 1700. That is when Europe has safely very much passed up the Islamic world, many would say, who count the beans and I don't, that now Europe actually does have the algebra and the calculus and the stuff, and so they are now starting to talk about themselves as objective scientific truth on Earth, as opposed to the other folks, the Muslims, they do the algebra and the stuff. Now you can safely be like, no, but this is scientific practice, and that is true in that it is the current, most up-to-date scientific practices of its day as Islamic money and power recedes in the world. And again, in the Americas, as mentioned a lot, you do see the Islamic world was continuous across Africa and the Middle East, and things had colonies. But the Europeans, they go very colonial, which means they can't really spread out as much as they go colonial, and I'm in the Americas, and on the other end of it, over here, and you've bested my Spaniard with the piracy, in the Caribbean, etc. So back and forth with the French and the Brits. Again, not so much the Germans. We'll get to German pessimism and why they're all sad about that, and then later a bit angry. That's history. So Leibniz, who we last covered, he wrote a rationalist rebuttal to this. The text influenced Hume, who's going to go even further, and Berkeley, who we're going to get to, Hume and Berkeley, called in this town Berkeley. Leibniz wrote a rationalist rebuttal to Locke's work, and he addressed Locke's work point by point, trying to show that, as I mentioned with the text the last time, he says, you empiricists are just dogs afraid of the stick you're beaten with. He's like, you don't come to principles, you're just afraid of deductive reasoning. An empiricist would say you're closed-minded and you're sticking to your principles. And again, I love to joke, and Groucho Marx says, and if you don't like them, well, I have others, because it's an empiricist going to be like, well, you shouldn't stick to principles that turn out are wrong. The example I love to give probably is here right in the notes. Aristotle says there are no white crows, there are no black swans. He actually does say this, and because he believes that all crows are categorically black birds. He is not speaking with the loaded ways of white and black. He actually thinks of those more as health conditions for human beings, like how pale you are and sickly, and uses the words that way. He is observing naturalistically his world, and he's a guy of his times. But he doesn't say, he says there are no white crows, no black swans, and it turns out both are in Australia at the time, and he didn't get to Australia. So it's nice to have principles, but if you inductively find things in Australia, now there's black swans wandering around hotel grounds in Hawaii and everywhere else. Whoa, that's trippy. With the goose stepping. Is that the black swans and other things is like, yeah, that's everything now. So actually that's a perfect rebuttal to at least one of Aristotle's principles there, or deductive, things that hold pieces of knowledge. So what happens when you get to Alpha Centauri and there's cold blue fire out there, or what have you? And again, here enters every person, no, I know already deductively it can't be, sure. Yeah, paradigm shift or not. And we don't know, in a sense, which is why I won't side with this or against this here, because we're opening up teaching the controversy. So Locke begins by stating that it is understanding, in his work, that sets humanity above the rest of the animals. That's very Aristotle. But unlike Aristotle and Descartes, who argue that it is reason, actually, Locke specifically says it's mental, what separates us from the animals, but actually Aristotle and Descartes say it's more reason that moves reasoning around. Now, this is actually a very interesting point. Hegel is later going to take these kind of words and say, understanding and reason, and Kant's going to do that before him, and Hegel very much takes it from Kant, actually. But Kant is looking at Locke and others and saying understanding is more the set, conservative part of the mind, and reason is kind of the part that moves it around, and then Hegel says it's the revolutionary, more left-wing, progressive French Revolution part of the mind historically. Excuse me, that is uncouth. Again. It's, yes, in the wings. So, basically, Aristotle and Descartes says we make moves of thought which allow us to be different from beasts. So, technically, they leave it open for beasts to have knowledge, but they don't say that, and they wouldn't say that. Locke actually here is saying we have fixed understandings we acquire from experience. That's what makes us different from beasts. Now, that is actually odd, and maybe he's just not splitting his terms here in ways he is also thinking, But actually, it would much more be human to often think that, yes, maybe dogs and cats don't understand anything. There are people who are like, cats don't understand anything. They don't have language. What are you thinking? Yes, actually, that's Wittgensteinian enough to say they don't understand things like us. But human beings are most proud with their thinking and reasoning. Wittgenstein does say if a dog suddenly stops in the middle of a room and turns and exits the room a different way, maybe there's a dog whistle, but if there's not, then possibly the dog was thinking because something sort of happened inside, although not, as Wittgenstein would quickly point out, entirely inside the dog, because the dog sort of had an inner dream, not entirely inner for the dog because it's kind of out in its world, but the dog thinks of something else uncued and then decides sort of and makes a choice somewhat independently as a whole experience, and that's kind of thought, free thought like us, is what Wittgenstein is pushing us towards. Then we would certainly say, well, the dog thought just there. It wasn't, if we know it isn't a dog whistle, and the dog heard because that could just be conditioning. But Locke here says it's actually understanding, having any knowledge at all, not reasoning and moves, that makes us different from the animals. And later, these pieces are very important for Kant and Hegel. So I'm not going to separate those out fully more so now. Just understand right now, we acquire things about swans and black swans, white or black, from induction. We learn that from example, 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 example. We could have deductive principles with the rationalists. Locke is actually arguing we actually have understanding. It separates us from the animals. Let's not get all too reasoned to deductive truth, and now I have a principle. Let's leave our understandings and knowledge open to slowly construct it. Seems to be his philosophy that he is constructing against those previous philosophies we've already discussed. He thinks those guys are too rationalist and deductive. They're not being open to something possibly like black swans in the future, so they're leaving it too closed up and not leaving it open. You could even think, again, given the political rantings I've done, would this leave Locke closed-minded to the Indians and Africans, or would this leave him open to new practices with India and Africa? And I'll just leave that right there, of course, because, of course, human beings are going to be all sorts of both individual and social, and that's going to be the good and the bad, all mixed up of all of that. And let's look at the psychology, for a moment of all of that. Not here, though. We're going to move on to the material here. By that, I mean the abstractions. Locke compares our faculty of understanding to the human eye. An object that is invisible, we look right through it. I often say we look right through the invisible, but it's very structural to us. That's very good as a metaphor for lenses, like Spinoza ground. It is that when we understand things, we're looking through them. Kant may or may not say glasses. It is very traditional to say now in philosophy, Kant says we look at the world through the glasses of our understanding. And that is very much what Locke is laying out, and Kant is going to pick up here after we get to Hume and Berkeley. Then we get to Kant. And Kant is going to say, yes, we look through our understandings at the world as if through glasses. I'm looking at the world as frames. So if I don't know math, I don't look at the world mathematically. If I develop and or have and I'm not looking through glasses, depends here, our arguments, then I look through math at the world, and then the world is mathematical. That is very much what Kant and Locke are saying, although Kant's going to say it much more glasses separate from the world in the mind later, and Locke is not necessarily saying that entirely. Wittgenstein puts these lenses out in the world as social practices, which is not in the mind, and that's what he's talking about. So the word faculty, or faculty of understanding, you can hear faculty of reason or faculty of understanding. This is very much the part of our mind, the part of our brain, the part of our life, whatever you want. But it's very much the organ of the mind. So the organ of our body and the faculty of our mind, meaning the part of our mind, is a fancy word these guys use. And it is like the faculty of history of a university. Something like the part of the university that engages in that. So the faculty of our reasoning is our reasoning. The part of our minds that engages in reason, like the history faculty, is the part of the staff and the teachers and professors that engage in history studies. So, yes, Locke has us consider the newborn baby. That's very Piaget a bit beforehand, and that's very empiricist. Think of the what we say here, tabula rasa, blank slate. Think of the baby getting imprinted by experience. It's very psychological, very empirical. Psychology tends to like the empiricists a lot, tends to mention them. Gopnik brings up Hume and Tibetan Buddhism and interesting things in Berkeley. So, I mean about, Hume and all of that, yes, in this town. So Locke gives us very little reason to say he thinks anything is in the baby in the first place. This is famously very nature-nurture, and Locke gives us tabula rasa, which is the blank slate. The baby is essentially blank coming out into the world. That is and isn't Piaget. That is certainly not Kant, and we will get to that. So, Kant thinks you already have cabinets in you, and they're waiting to be filled. But he's getting that somewhat from Locke, and Locke is very much, no, you are a blank slate. So while Locke supposes that in later stages of prenatal development, the fetus could have experiences in the womb, he stresses it is through experience, being impressed by perceptions, that a child comes to have understandings. Locke says he will ignore what relationship matter has on our minds or ideas and focus on the part of our minds which gather knowledge. Again, he does not actually say the part of our minds that reason. He says what is the form of knowledge, and how you reason to knowledge and knowledge bases reason is this sort of thing that he doesn't talk out entirely, and other thinkers are going to say, like Descartes, you didn't do enough here. Locke could have said that reason is the eye through which we view the world and proceeded as a rationalist to examine our faculty of reason, but as an empiricist, he focuses on how our faculty of understanding gathers experience together to create knowledge. And Wittgenstein would say practices. Locke says that we must ask what measures the certainty of our knowledge when we see how others eagerly embrace completely opposite opinions and positions, or else we would suspect that there is no such thing as truth, or that there is, but we do not have the faculty to obtain it. We must find the boundary between opinion and knowledge. That is very... Again, we go back and forth possibly between the objective and the subjective and the dogmatic and the skeptical positions of philosophy and thought. Do we ever find a boundary between red and square? Do we draw apart subjectivity and objectivity entirely? Or do we only partly? Is very much the issues that are happening here and are going to go on throughout philosophy. And I happen to like a lot of those answers and discussing them and being into the history of this, which is what I'm teaching you. Locke likely knows that Plato and Aristotle argue there is a difference between matters of multiple opinion and singular knowledge, such as tastiest flavor of ice cream is a good example, and the answer to 2 + 3 = 5 is just rattle off the top of your head what's something subjective flavor of ice cream, what's something objective 2 + 3, and the answer to that in arithmetic. Because there's many flavors of ice cream you could like, perhaps garlic in the Gilroy Garlic Festival. They have garlic ice cream here in this state. Never tried it. Probably not gonna. It's not so Ben or Jerry. But as far as 2 + 3 = 5, that's always the same flavor. So Locke, like Kant, wants to distinguish things we can know with certainty, again, rather singularly, it's the singular answer 5. Notice that's quantitative like the square, from tastiest flavor of ice cream, which notice that's actually like shades of color and gray. Yes, oddly enough. Quantities are very black and white. Colors are very shades of gray, etc. I have a good image I often put in the notes. There's shades of gray like green gray, yellow gray, reddish gray, purplish gray. Actually, yeah, that's even more mind-blowing, because we didn't say shades of only black, white, gray, and you can see those oddly. Makes cool t-shirts, dark green, gray, what have you. So, essentially, Locke wants to separate out what we can separate out and singularize down to the singular answers, and that's the objective truth to 2 + 3 = 5, not a shade of red, slightly, again. So, much like many would say biology, in fact, is a real hard science, but sociology is kind of like your opinion and speculative interpretation, man, and still say that today. Saint-Simon would be sad. We'll get to that. That's back in France, and later. Locke says that our minds may be narrow, but we should use them as best we can, rather than refuse to work by the candlelight we have, he says, which is a wonderful... Locke has, and all these thinkers have great things you can use, even if you or I are or are not into their work. I tend to share my biases and my opinions on my sleeve, of course, with all of this, but I am trying to point you to what are the structures here that we feel oppositely about. He says, rather than refuse to work by the candlelight we have and wait for the broad light of day, we're not going to get everything necessarily completely revealed before we're starting to make moves here. We should make satisfying discoveries with the candlelight we have, which is bright enough for our purposes. That is a wonderful phrase, and it's very true. We should not demand certainty where there is only probability in our concerns. That's possibility, better than certainty. Nor should we doubt everything because we can't know all things. Locke argues that this is a cure for skepticism, much as Descartes thought of, I think, therefore I am. Locke argues that knowledge is not innate, as there are no things that everyone universally agrees to. Which is odd for him to say here if you get what we've been saying so far. Not even the two most questionable maxims, whatever is, and it is impossible for the same thing to be and not be. Now that's actually Leibniz. He is going after a bit here, and Leibniz is refuting him. Whatever is, that's the principle of identity. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not be is the principle of non-contradiction. And Locke says, and he's right, not everybody agrees to those, though. How are there stupid people who don't agree to them? That's a problem. Even if you say we ought to adhere to the principle of non-contradiction, why are we people who have to adhere to it, right? That isn't entirely agreeable, even if it should be. So that's a problem. This is also, Frege says, that we have boundary stones of reasoning and logic. We can overflow them, but we can't supplant them. It's like, but then why do we overflow them? What kind of an organism is that? Like, okay, is that just the emotions or wishy-washy extra in life as opposed to math? That's going to be a real problem for especially more romantic and more subjective, thinkers later. It's like, oh, so the meaningful in life isn't emotional. I see. That's a good way of living life, says Nietzsche. No, it isn't. That's terrifying. So, again, that's being an accountant for Nietzsche, not having much of a life. But that is, again, hopefully accountants all have lives, forms of life outside and inside of all that. Again, much love. But again, it's horrible Dickensian London and soot and orphans a bit for Nietzsche. So Greek skeptics, such as Heraclitus, argue that as everything changes, everything, including ourselves, is and is not, being what they were and not together as they change. Locke says even though these two maxims, the principle of identity and non-contradiction, what Heraclitus in ancient Greece would deny, are difficult for many to doubt. Many on earth do not know them, and some highly doubt them. He is thinking of Africans, uneducated probably. They just aren't knowing it yet. And then he's like, but some Europeans are telling me I'm wrong, So there are some maxims, general rules that hold. General, that leaves loose window open in the back for Wittgenstein. General rules, maxims, generalities, not universalities, that hold, to which many people agree are true. But children, idiots, the illiterate, and savages, he says, have not the least thought of them. What he is saying is the principle of non-contradiction ain't on your blank slate. That's actually what he is saying. You do not have the principle of non-contradiction in you, even though in a certain sense he is going to support somewhat Leibniz's principle of non-contradiction in spirit, and then Kant very much does, picking up Locke and trying to extend this stuff, and getting upset at Hume, trying to go more Locke than Hume, better than Locke, in fact, which is Kant, and then still analytic philosophy very much, which still includes Hume, oddly. And they do, and still love Hume, which is weird. That in there are general rules that hold, but if you are the savage, quotey, who has not yet gotten the burden of white man's reason, nor are and you're the 2-year-old child who hasn't yet learned to talk, you don't have the principle of non-contradiction in you yet, which means you have to learn it, even if you are correct in it, or everybody would be. So he is emphasizing the blank slate. He has just taken away the principle of identity. That's actually very much object permanence a bit, and should be seen that way, I think, and we're going to get to that here. But he also has taken away the principle of non-contradiction right from under us, which leaves us a radically blank slate. Even if he believes those are objective truths, very basic, you see. Like, that is what he is doing here, and that is very fascinating for psychology. Do we or don't we know the principle of non-contradiction, and how? And is that true to what extent? There's a lot of that in the philosophy, and psychology is a thing of the late 1800s, of course, by name. This is where psychology is happening for a lot of people. Before psychology was a word, in Europe, anyway. So Locke does say that there are ideas we can all agree to if we use reason together correctly, so he does believe in objective truth like these based on our common experience of the world, but these are not innate ideas we have since birth. We agree and understand much without the use of reason. The two maxims, what is and what isn't, are both quite understandable, but neither require reason. We move from our experience with particular things, ideas, and names stored in our memory, our empty cabinet, he says, without drawers. Kant thinks we have a cabinet with specific slots in it pre-made like time and space, because he's a bit Aristotelian with the categories. A bit, not entirely though. He says Aristotle screwed it up with his 10. That we have abstract ideas and general names. We become familiar with these things and create the material out of which we understand everything and anything. Children know the difference between sweet and bitter before they can speak their names, because through taste, though, they don't know what sweet is before tasting it, but then they know before they name it and learn the word, and then learn abstract conceptions of sensation in classrooms long after that. A child does not know that 3 and 4 are 7 until they are able to count to 7, and then they construct in the mind the correct thing and understand based on their experience of adding 3 to 4. The child settles into clear and distinct ideas. Clear and distinct ideas is Locke's language, which is interesting to quote and then consider back and forth, yes? Do we have... Wittgenstein says our thought has ragged edges, blurry at the boundaries, like your field of vision. Does your field of vision have clear and distinct edges? And does society, man? The child, Locke says and argues, settles into clear and distinct ideas. Well, we're talking about math, aren't we? And yet, still, such that what is, 3 plus 4 equals 7, and cats are not weasels, all that's plenty fuzzy at the boundaries sometimes, none of which is innate or reasoned, and neither are my pair of love weasels here, the sugar marmots, as I sometimes call them, because I'm being a bit ragged at the edges and with my jokes, and a bit hairy here. So Locke argues that there is nothing more basic than 1 plus 2 equals 3. He goes quantitative. I keep saying, actually, and again, I have been talking about in logic, people go quantitative so quickly, that's objective truth. Keep in mind, people may have only had quantities and number words, possibly for only a few thousand years, and the human brain's far longer. In a certain sense, it's very odd, thus. Shades of red, and we can talk about the colorblind in ourselves, as Wittgenstein reminds us, shades of red are not as objective to Locke as 1 plus 2 equals 3, even though technically we and the colorblind, even talking about it against the color-sighted, let's say, actually, which is various forms, they both groups would talk about red a lot, even if the colorblind would have to fake it somewhat, or be like, well, I don't see that, but you do. We'll talk about red a lot before even using number words, it may be. Some may say number words are just as basic as, early on to language. I am pushing that it may be number words, as some have said, a little bit closer. Again, don't sleep, there are snakes, may suggest we haven't been that numerical for long. So it is odd that Locke actually here says there is nothing more basic to knowledge in the mind than 1 plus 2 equals 3. That is very tempting. After you have modern society division of labor in classrooms. Is that tempting in a tribal society that's illiterate beforehand? Possibly. How could it even possibly be, I say? The whole is bigger than the part, Locke says. We know this. And Locke says, like Descartes, we also certainly and completely know, rather scientifically, God is a superior, wise being to be worshipped, he says. He includes that in his list of 1 plus 2 equals 3 and objective knowledge. This is, again, whether or not you feel that way or not, it is very odd to the religious and the non-religious alike today to hear a guy in the 1700s say, oh yeah, there's objective knowledge, we can get that scientifically, 1 plus 2 equals 3, also we can deduce empirically, God is a superior being who should be worshipped. Because a lot of evangelicals would say, well, I have faith beyond science, what the heck is that? Well, he is, of course, trying to make room for religion and science and all of that in his day. Again, as he's making room enough in places for the East Africa Company. The East India Company, sorry, that is actually more mill. And again, the Royal Africa Company. I am misspeaking, thankfully, corporate history, which is very much that, starting with the royals and the not so privatized, is actually not entirely my specialty. So I forgot to go off about corporations. I'm glad I did, because we have more privatized ones than the royal chartered corporations, which is where our corporations actually come from, is from those British kinds of corporations and structures, which then have been modified to be more privatized today. Not that they're still those two, they're for all kinds, of things, and even nonprofits. All ideas, according to Locke, come from experience, including my harebrained schemes about corporations. So from sensation or reflection, perception or thought, that's body and mind very much. And both of these use the material of experience, body, mental experience. Hume argues that all of our experience can be divided into impressions and ideas, very similar to Locke, with sensations as impressions of the outer world and reflections as ideas in the mind. Locke famously argues that the mind is originally a blank slate, a tabula rasa in the Latin, which he also refers to as an empty cabinet. In the early days of human writing, scribes would make impressions on clay tablets, which were then heated to preserve the markings. As an empiricist, Locke argued that there are no innate ideas in the human mind, and that all ideas are acquired by experience. Again, Hume is going to say that, but then he takes this even farther, and he says, so truth is habit and prejudice. And Kant's like, I don't like that at all. I don't want 2 plus 3 equals 5 to be a prejudice and a habit. I want it to be structurally true. So he goes looking for the structure of the human mind, which means he can't go with Locke's blank slate. That's what's coming in the simplest words. Locke, like many intellectuals of his time, had read a 12th century, so around 1100s, Arabic novel by Ibn Tufayl, I didn't know about this until late in the game, only a couple years ago, translated into Latin entitled Living Son of Wakening, which tells the story of a child isolated from human society on a desert island who grows naturally by experience and reason to human adulthood. Some have called it the first philosophical novel in history. Again, there's always first here and there. That's usually just let's learn about more cultures. A thought experiment designed to demonstrate Avicenna's empirical theories. Now, I like Avicenna, and Avicenna is similar here to some of the empiricists. We won't go into that right here. Another popular novel at the time was Robinson Crusoe. Carousing, I misspeak, which features a civilized gentleman and a native savage on an island, nature and nurture, in the state of nature. As Muslims and Europeans were traveling around the world, being civilized and encountering other cultures who weren't literate and don't have as much technology, etc., and interacting with them in various ways, as we can again pass over in the first part of the talk, in sort of trade and empire, let's call it. They ask themselves questions about nature versus nurture, about whether cultures are innately different from or different due to experience and education. Locke, like Ibn Tufail, believed that education is central to all development and that the mind is an empty cabinet waiting to be filled, a white piece of paper, waiting to be written upon, and a dark room waiting to be filled with light. And again, the dark versus the light, unfortunately and ironically, all of that, don't you think? So I also say at the time, I don't have the thing down here, actually. I got to find that guy's name again. But actually around the same time as Ibn Tufail wrote that work, there is a very interesting, hilarious, which I haven't read through, but it is hilarious that it exists. A Persian playwright at the time wrote a work called actually The Whites versus the Blacks. And he means the Persians as whites. Persians called themselves white people before Spanish, and then Europeans somewhat called themselves white-ish people superior. But there's a history behind that gets complicated. So actually, Europeans are not the first people to call themselves white or superior because they're white. That's actually India and Persia and a bit of China and then later Europe as they get money and power, funny enough. And they are white enough, Again, Irish sea, strange, large, yellow UFO in the sky, according to The Onion last week, years ago. So maybe they've seen it since. So if we are, yes, and with all of that, of course, as I jest. If, as with all of this, if we are each a blank slate, what constitutes our identity? Now notice principle of identity, what makes you the you then, steadily. This is one of the great thought experiments, the brain in a vat thought experiment, which is not Locke, but is very much Descartes' man of industry working Locke's brains in Futurama puts a bunch of heads of celebrities in vats. They're in like liquid, in clear liquid in a container, and they can kind of see everybody as a floating head. That very much is the sci-fi brain in a vat. And that's how, again, Descartes' deceiving demon was like there's a mad scientist poking electrified knitting needles in a vat, and then you got Keanu waking up in the Matrix like, whoa, I know Kung Fu, which is a more modern, very much Descartes, Plato cave brain in a vat. So what is our identity? How do we know who we are each individually? Locke argues that the self is a continuity of consciousness, an extension of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. So I think, and then I continue to think, and that's me continuing to be, which is me continuing to be conscious at length, which is me. So Avicenna and Descartes each argue that our consciousness is the only thing about which we cannot be deceived. Locke then takes the idea further by considering consciousness as a continued experience. Descartes had focused on the moment that consciousness arrives at its own certainty through rationality, while Descartes argued that he deduces it. Oh, I'm here. Well, that's not the popping in of his self, but he kind of comes to that, I must be a self and God must be real. While Descartes argues that from this fact we can rationally deduce several other truths, Locke argues that we cannot, by reason alone, deduce facts from consciousness, but only gather them through continuous experience. So you're only continuing to experience yourself as a self. That's experience. That's inductive. In my undergrad days, again, we were given the brain in a vat thought experiment, which is a bit of I think, therefore I am walked out through Locke, and then the mad scientist before the Matrix. And I just tell my class, many of whom, not all, were born after, all of the Matrix movies were safely made, of course, now. I definitely tell them, well, that all was before your time, with the Wachowski sisters. Again, it involves a machine, though. Imagine a machine that has the power to affect brains in ways as yet undiscovered. It has magical powers. We call the brain switch machine in the brain switch thought experiment. That's my weird, stupid words for this thing. That's not what it's called, but I call it that now, brain switch thought experiment machine. So the brain switch thought experiment, or the brain switch machine thought experiment. Imagine two people are placed in a machine that switches brains between the two bodies, and then similarly exchanges and dubs out the contents of their minds, and then switches the contents of each minds electrically. Now, I will grant you, some may say, and I'll agree with you, you couldn't just take electricity out of the brain and not alter the neurons and how they're intertangled, and that would be the person's personality. Let's just imagine here for purposes, silly-wise, you can just take the content out of somebody's brain without re-twirling their neurons around, which I don't actually think is correct, because we grow in our brains. It's not just the electricity that's our software, as opposed to the hardware. It's, and then it's confusing to say, no, it's just the electricity you experience or not, but I'm just going to leave all that where it is. But imagine you can switch my brain with somebody else's, with a cat, and then you switch, that is amusing more than this, yes, you put me and the cat into the machine, the cat and I, yes, let's be proper and formal with the cat here, and you then switch my brain with the cat brain, and then you take the cat's thoughts out of the cat's brain, put them in my brain, and vice versa, right? So now what's happened is you have technically kept the same body with the same thoughts and the same personality, but you've actually switched the brain such that technically this is actually the person living in somebody else's brain thinking they're someone else, right? Now, what Locke says is person A now B? And in fact, it is, of course, now we have reasons to sort of feel both, but we could say they're not who they were anymore quantitatively, but there is something very much where we would say numerically. And Locke argues, person A may be an entirely different person after the process, but person A remains A and is not person B because B still has their continuity of consciousness. Funny enough, they are experiencing themselves falsely as another person, but actually it is not the old consciousness in the same skull. It is a different consciousness. That consciousness is now experiencing world as some other false person over in another body, right? It's actually my cat, which is actually now in my body thinking my thoughts, I assure you. That's what happened before I started giving this lecture, clearly. So, yes, now you're actually the cat, and you're pretending to be Eric and have the Eric body and think the cat's Eric, but actually it's not me. I'm now in the cat's body, but I'm thinking I'm a cat, is what this is. That does actually make it oddly clearer, and I'm going to continue to do that with the cat, but not for realsies, in the abstract, and the thought experiments. The identity has thus been entirely switched out and altered, even though all the content and the knowledge and the principle of non-contradiction or not, whether or not it's correct, and the arithmetic is there. That is what he is arguing. There are two sides of the situation. On the one hand, we do consider the identity of a person to be qualitative, a matter of character. So in fact, if my friend turns into a total jerk, I do say somewhat, well, he's the same consciousness, but my friend is really gone. It is not the same person, plenty. And that is plenty true. Severe Alzheimer's, amnesia, it's like the person's no longer the person. And what we treasure about a person is how they qualitatively are, such that if a person's, emotions completely change, they very much aren't the person we hung out with. But at the same time, of course, especially if you're someone's mother, and you're a loving parent or so, and then they totally are altered personality-wise, you could very easily still stick with them and love the whole organism, because even if it is no longer the person, it still is quantitatively. And we only got quantitative possibly much later, so much, more and less this or that identity. But number words, as far as quantities, identities, and more or less, beyond that, which we have words for this and that, more and less, possibly before number words in human civilizations. Well, as civilizations, actually. So oddly enough, that this or that person, before number words even, is this or that person is, in fact, what Locke is arguing is primarily important to us as the actual consciousness continuing. Think also even of animism and how people did in the ancient world, of course, and in pre-literate times, believe very much, you or I are judged rightly or wrongly, perhaps, whatever, that some other spirit comes into your mind and then now that's something else or something if you're possessed. If we were to somehow transfer the consciousness of B along with the mental content, which the imaginary machine does not do, Locke would have to conclude that A is now B as B's continue. So if you dub out the consciousness, of course, along with the content and the knowledge and the identity, name, and the thought of oneself and images of oneself in the mirror, yes, then technically Locke would say the consciousness went with it. But that's, of course, if the consciousness goes with it. We're not taking that. We're leaving that with the brain. That's what I'm saying. The consciousness is going with the brain, not the content. And then I already said, I don't actually know that I can do that with science, or anybody can. A man of great industry, as Descartes says, a mad scientist who'd have to be, So, like Descartes, Locke argues that it is rational to believe, we are on the hour, but I only have a point or two more, Locke argues it is rational to believe in mathematics, discoveries of science, and God. But unlike Descartes, Locke argues these things are known through experience and evidence. Inductively, we know God for certain. Which again, people would be surprised that early thinkers are like, no, deductively we know science and God. And now he's like, no, inductively we know swans, black swans, and God. While Descartes argues that we can create rational arguments that prove the existence of God, Locke argues that belief in God is rational based on the evidence of miracles, which we can take as true testimony, like for the Nyaya of India, which testimony is an important component of logic, and it still is, and in courts. This is similar to the ancient Chinese philosopher Mozi, his argument that all cultures have seen ghosts, and this is solid evidence that ghosts exist and punish the wicked, a la PTSD, and people you kill, whether for good or bad reasons, according to Grossman's On Killing, they come back and visit you, whether or not you did it for the right or wrong reasons, so don't go around off and fools a bunch. Not at all, even. Similarly, Locke's friend Newton believed that the solar system would spin out eventually if it were not for the fact God poked his finger in or something occasionally to straighten it out. Like his friend Newton, Locke believed that animal spirits are electric in nature. That's very, even Poe 1800s, that it's something like electrical spirits, and this is, metaphysical real. And they reside in the muscles and communicate with the brain. I always like to say, I don't actually know if this finger is conscious or not. It's hard for me to say. Some people say, oh, that's all an image in the brain. I know the brain thing. But if this is nerves, and if the brain is nerves, am I conscious right here in the end of my fingertips or not? Or is that an illusion of the brain? All I usually tell people, as of yet, I don't know anybody who can answer this. Wittgenstein would say we may not have the processes to answer that. But there are people who have opinions about that, and again, maybe they do know this or that about the brain that I am not bringing up here and I am ignorant of. But if nerves are nerves are nerves, the nerves are nerves out here with the electricity and the chemicals too. And which part of that is where is the qualia, endlessly. You can go qualia hunting, in the mornings. So Locke makes a distinction between simple ideas such as color, shapes, tastes, and complex ideas such as identity and cause and effect. This is where he's going to pull objective truth out of. Actually, it's a construct made of many things, not a simple thing such as red, which is also a little odd. That objective truth is complex, because actually 2 + 3 = 5 should be simple, not several shades of red, which kind of goes in weird opposite directions. And he doesn't add it up entirely, I'd say. This is where others come in. Hume follows Locke in arguing that causation is a complex idea, a concept composed of several elements that we put together mentally. Locke also makes a distinction between primary qualities, such as shape, arrangement, and motion, and subjective, secondary qualities, such as color and taste. Locke argues that primary qualities are objective, like squareness, whereas secondary qualities are subjective, like redness. Sensations that do not objectively exist independent of our experience, but only via collective experience. Now again, the best way of saying that is, Locke seems to be saying something like, for you and a dog, a square must be a square, even if a dog can't quantize, or use any math. But a red has to be different for you and I and the dog, or for peoples, but that actually is the colorblind, and then a square is you. A square is a square and quantitative for you and I and the colorblind and the blind, is what he's kind of saying, but that's more my using Wittgenstein's examples. I already went over, again, a bit of the red square, and here I have ranted a bit. So many have questioned the distinction. It does seem the shape of a square is not open for debate, and it's rather quantized and set in black and white. But we can conceive, like Descartes, this is, and he does say Satan could be just tricking me, putting in an extra apricot such that I think 2 + 3 = 6, and it turns out I'm just being fooled. He does say that. So Descartes, who is big into deduction, he even admits math could be a lie by Satan. Oh, but guess what? The Gnostics are wrong, because I'm conscious, therefore not a lie, which many say, maybe that may or may not upset the Gnostics. Locke does say that we can imagine our senses were different in number, and this would profoundly affect our experience of the world. The oatmeal brought up mantis shrimp a couple of years ago. Mantis shrimp see way more colors than we do, it turns out, and are very multicolored. Look up mantis shrimp, they're amazing looking, and so they see more colors than we do. So what happens if we saw that? We'd see way more reds, What if our tactile and visual senses were greatly enhanced now, I say, such that similarly, perfect squares actually never appear square because we've never seen straight lines. They're always a bit jagged and crooked and round on little bits, because we're just so well-sighted, we've never seen a square in our lives. Would you say that isn't perception or construction? There's problems here, of course. Would we have to be able to construct straight lines? Is that just a necessity? Why? We can't have vision beyond that, ever imperfect, but we just don't care and we're happy with it? Why? Why wouldn't those be practices? Or eyes? Or a different sight? While Locke considers motion to be objective, like his friend Newton, notice, Einstein argued motion is relative. Again, time and space somewhat relative. We do not even need to approach light speed to demonstrate this, as the Earth, from our point of view, is stationary and the stars circle overhead. The ancient Greek Pyrrhonian skeptic Sextus Empiricus, I got lectures on that fits very well in against this, argues that shape and motion can vary by perspective, giving several good examples. A cone, he says, appears triangular from the side, yet circular from above. I do like to say I watched a educational cartoon as a kid. There's a couple of shapes that rob a bank wearing little bank masks. They're of different colors, red, blue, and green, of course. And we're not being racist toward the green cones here. And one witness from the ground says something like, I want to get this correct, 2 triangles and a square robbed the bank. And the guy from above says, no, 2 squares and a circle robbed the bank. And it turns out a cone, a pyramid, and a cylinder robbed the bank, which from whichever direction here you get is from the side is 2 triangles and a square. And from above is 2 squares and a square and 2 circles. Hopefully, again, I'm mix that up a little bit, but you get what I mean. So is squareness objective? And as I put in the end of the piece, there is actually an artist did a piece where it turns out if you make sort of egg-shaped, somewhat elliptical sides and then put them in a square, and those are facing you with the edges, and you put a mirror next to it to see, you can actually walk around the figure, and it's square, it's squaring the circle, which is an old alchemical problem. Something about making the human more perfect and circular and divine also symbolically. Something that alchemists and apparently other esoteric people didn't really, with Muslims and Christians and Jewish mysticism, never entirely figured out in the Middle Ages. Some say is an impossible problem. But this artist makes a square circle, which is you view it as a square and a circle from different sides. Sadly, what happens if we perceive it from one side, say there's an objective square, that can't at all be circular, because what is a square in opposition to what's not a square? Well, circular is not a square. How do you have both at the same time? Different angles, that leaves you subjective open. What if it's an angle you're looking at it from? Locke says, we can't afford to be certain where there is strong evidence, but we should provisionally entertain, keep going around it, new things when there is only weak evidence. New evidence must be continuously sought, but coherent knowledge is strongly supported by evidence that can be acquired. Locke uses his friend Newton, and his discovery of gravity is a positive example. He says gravity's real, it's fixed. Guess what? Actually, it's his gravity entirely constant after Einstein. As well as Jesus and his ethical teaching to love one's neighbor. So Locke is actually, we know objective and rational things we construct are real, like gravity and loving your neighbor, which of course we've actually built out in the real world something magnificently. Us, Christianity, and everyone aside, of course. He says this is all confirmed by experience, perhaps next week. Below, again, well, yes, I already talked about the circular square. That is just over an hour. Again, please feel free to pause and listen to these talks, as I hope you do. A little bit at length if I go quickly through the things. I am going to try to parse out chapters to make this easier to follow and find. I rewind YouTube videos all the time and miss the points. But much love, everybody. Again, perhaps love is objective force or subjective. I'm actually into how basic emotions with Wittgenstein are. Anger is not something in your head, and it's also something both in your head and out in the world together, which means anger. Somebody being angry is like red, very objective and very subjective, depending on back and forth and what it is. I am of that opinion. So much love and happiness. I was going to say, hopefully that's both objective and subjective for you, kind of a bit, both inside and outside, all around, in your family and not. Hopefully because others other than your family have some love. And I will see you, if I ever see you.